It is a feeling of angst, stress, pressure, a collective sense of anxiety. Joining us now to tell us what this anxiety is born of and what can be done to help us cope. In New York City, Daniel Smith, author of Monkey Mind, a memoir of anxiety. And with us here in the studio, Quam McKenzie, senior scientist, health services and health equity research at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Patricia Pearson, author of A Brief History of Anxiety. Alex Russell, child psychologist at Hincks Delcrest Center here in Toronto. And University of Prince Edward Island historian Ian Dobigan, author of The Quest for Mental Health, A Tale of Science, Medicine, Scandal, Sorrow, and Mass Society. And we want to, of course, remind everybody that we want to hear from you on this topic. Our producers are hosting a live chat right now with a representative from the Mental Health Hotline, Connects Ontario, as we've done all week. It's on our homepage, theagenda.tvo.org. You can also join us via Twitter. Please use the hashtags MHMatters for Mental Health Matters or hashtag AgendaTVO. And it's great to have everybody around the table. And Daniel, once again, to you joining us in New York City. This is the final installment of our Mental Health Matters series, and I'm going to start by doing something completely ridiculous. Ready? Okay. You are the brother of
Bruce Dobigan,
who has been on this program a few times and whom we love. Mm-hmm. You are the son of
Peter Russell,
the University of Toronto constitutional professor, who has been on this program many times and whom we love. You are
Patricia, the granddaughter of somebody or other.
Patricia, the granddaughter of somebody other who might have been prime minister once upon a time,
Maybe.
Who we never had on this program, I'm sorry to say. And what many people don't know is that Quam McKenzie is actually the great-grandson of Alexander Mackenzie, the second prime minister of Canada, which is, no, that's not true. Sorry, I didn't want you to feel left out, that's all.
Laughter is a good remedy for anxiety.
That's why I did that, ma'am. You're reading my mind. Here we go. I'm going to start by reading something Lisa Miller wrote in the New York Times Magazine last year. It goes like this. 3.5 years of chronic economic wobbliness, the ever-pinging of the new email alert, the insistent voices of prophet pundits who cry that nuclear, environmental, political, or terrorist-generated disaster is certain to have together turned a depressed nation into a perennially anxious one. The editors at the New York Times are running a weekly column on anxiety in their opinion section with this inarguable rationale, quote, "We worry." Patricia, are the editors of the New York Times onto something?
Well, I mean, they're New Yorkers, right? So, of course, they have their own special claim to anxiety and neurosis. I think that probably the most operative factor right now in the North American climate is uncertainty. So people who are already wired for anxiety, the worst thing that you can do is make them uncertain. They'd prefer the devil that they know to the devil that they don't know, at least in my experience and in my observations. So that's a big factor right now.
Daniel, you're down there in New York City. Is it because you're New Yorkers, or is the Times onto something?
Well, Patricia's right in that it certainly doesn't help to be a New Yorker. The Times onto something in that we're certainly living in an age of anxiety, but I'm not sure that the claim, which is often made, that we're living in the age of anxiety is also true. Patricia used the word uncertainty. Anxiety has always flourished in times when there have been uncertainty. If we think that we have it bad, I mean, look back at the 14th century when there was a church schism, there were roving hordes of bandits, there was the Black Plague, and anxiety, by the documents we have, was really epidemic, just like it is now. So I think that we might not be so different, but we're certainly living through another period where uncertainty is at high levels, and therefore anxiety and nervousness is also at high levels.
Ian, I'm told that those columns in the New York Times get as much, if not more, feedback, emails, responses, and so on from readers than anything they do. You're the historian. You heard the historical references there. Are they onto something?
Anxiety is certainly the disease du jour of for people who suffer from mental disorders. I think there's an important, and to get back to what one of the things Daniel said was, it's very important to recognize that what distinguishes our era, this age, among other things, is that we live in a kind of illness-affirming society, which is totally unlike any other previous age in history. And by that I mean, we are told constantly that anxiety disorders are underdiagnosed, that a lot of people suffer from it. that we should seek professional help at the first sign of this kind of anxiety disorders, that there's nothing wrong with having anxiety, that we're victims of incalculable forces out there. And what I think this does is it reinforces what it does is it weakens the sense of stoicism that our ancestors used to have not so long ago. And what it does is, I think it disables us, in a sense, from dealing with the everyday trials and tribulations which do produce anxiety. So I would say that that, too, is a characteristic feature of today's world.
Quam, do you think that's true? It disables us from meeting these challenges in a better way?
Well, first of all, I know you started off by you're talking about my great-grandfather, Alexander. Actually, Alexander Mackenzie is my son. So as soon as you said, and you started talking about Alexander Mackenzie, I thought, how do you know about Alexander Mackenzie, my son?
Maybe a future Prime Minister.
Who you never know, maybe
never
a
know.
future Prime Minister of Canada. I think that there are some problems with the way things are going in society. I think you see many more anxiety disorders clinically, and that could be because people are told they should turn up for treatment, or it could be because we're more anxious. Now, what we know is not just in ages of uncertainty, but at times of change, people become anxious. And that's useful in some ways because it stimulates us, it makes us more productive, it makes us more efficient. Anxiety isn't all bad, but there'll always be some people who won't be able to cope with the uncertainty, with the change, and they will develop mental health problems that rightly need treatment because they can't do it on their own. Also, one of the things that is happening at this time of change is the social supports that used to be there to help people deal with their mental health problems, the family supports, the social cohesion. That's not there either. And so people rightly seek professional help and should seek professional help. The main problem is we don't have enough professional help to deal with everybody who is anxious and who has an anxiety disorder. And that's a very real problem because people are seeking help, they're not getting help, and then they're having to deal with it themselves, and if they could have, they would have.
We'll follow up on the sort of social family network angle that you just brought up later in the program, but Alex, maybe you can tell me, do you buy Ian's premise that we are kind of disproportionately at this moment in our history suffering from these kinds of anxiety attacks?
Well, I mean, I appreciate that your comment that you know, we are an illness-affirming society. It's an interesting comment, and I agree. But it comes right here that we really are actually seeing more anxious people in our consulting rooms, in our hospitals, and children as well. I mean, just to give you an example, I had in my office this week an 8-year-old boy with an anxiety disorder. Not because he's heard through the newspapers that he should, but because he's so anxious about his marks that he can hardly go to school. So, I mean, we really are in an age where there are people who are struggling with anxiety in ways that they didn't before.
Is he struggling with his marks because his parents are putting undue pressure on him to?
Well,
because they're anxious about the world?
They don't think they are, right? And so you were mentioning we need more treatments for people with anxiety disorders. We need more people to treat the anxiety disorders. But when you do the kind of work I do as a clinical psychologist in Toronto, and looking at families and the kinds of anxieties that children are feeling these days, you can't help get into a preventative frame of mind, which is we need to think about why we're stressing our kids out so much and actually practice preventative medicine here. I mean, our kids are the safest in history, but they look like they're probably the most stressed out.
Quam.
I can't help but agree with you. Going back to Alexander Mackenzie, my son, I remember him once saying to me, and I think he was about 15 at the time, he said, "But Dad, what are you worrying about? We're middle-class kids in the 4th biggest economy in the world. This is when we're in the UK. We're going to be okay." And we were sort of, both me and my wife going, "Oh, yeah."
It hadn't occurred to you till he mentioned it?
Well, because you get into one of the things that is really stressing kids. It is all of this competition, constant comparison between each other, constant connectivity. You know, you're texting, you're on Facebook all of the time, and you know they are finding it stressful. And then examination marks. I mean, I was examined and like everybody else, and there's no way out of it. But there are questions about whether we have to ramp up the anxiety to the level that we need to, given our real current social circumstances.
So do you want to tell parents to stop the illness-affirming business and just sort of hunker down a bit? Is that what you're at?
I should have prefaced my comment, Steve, by saying that I don't dispute that people do feel anxious, that these feelings are very real and they're very painful. My only point was that we live in a society which includes a lot of different institutions, including the educational institutions, including families, where it's progressively becoming popular to teach young people, indeed, in school, precisely the things I was talking about, that it's natural. In fact, it's normal to be anxious. And that lesson is becoming, I believe, very pervasive. And as an historian, I can see how this differs substantially from previous eras. Well, let's face it, our ancestors, our grandparents were told, you know, if you encounter problems in life, you simply put your shoulder to the wheel, you keep your feelings to yourself, you deal with your problems yourself. That doesn't mean that people in the past didn't suffer in silence, they did. But what we've seen, in short, I think, is an enormous swing of the pendulum today to the other extreme. And I'd like to see some kind of middle position taken.
Patricia, you want to come in on that?
Well, I remember doing some research when I was writing my book that showed that the difference between the child-rearing styles of Chinese parents and Canadian parents, no, I think it was American and Chinese, was that the Chinese parents didn't encourage their children to self-monitor. So they had a style of parenting that made children less vigilant about their emotional state. And this corresponded with a somewhat lower level of anxiety in that culture. I think that's shifted now. I think the Chinese are getting very interested in anxiety, actually. But at the time, sort of 10 or 15 years ago, there was something in our encouragement of, and I see myself doing this actually with my own kids sometimes. It's like, how are you feeling? But really, how are you feeling? I want to know how you're feeling. So then they learn to start to really monitor their feelings. And then they have to start to weigh, where am I being normal and where am I being off normal, and should I display, you know, a kind of attention affirming behavior too. So that's, I agree with him to some extent in terms of how that can enter and become insidious in the culture.
Daniel, let me read something to you that Charles Barber wrote in Salon.com just a couple of days ago, or a few days ago, I guess, and then I'll get you to comment on this first. Under the heading, CNN is the new bogeyman. Here's what they write. But in the past 10 years, we have been engaged in an ongoing narrative of American trauma. After 9/11 came Katrina, then the economic meltdown, and the recession that never seems to end. This past year saw Sandy, followed by Newtown. Along the way, there's been the mass killings at Virginia Tech, at Northern Illinois University, and in a Colorado movie theater. There also seems to be a deepening sense that one can never fully escape from potential catastrophe. Not on a Boston street on a promising spring day, or in a Connecticut elementary school a few weeks before Christmas. You know, you guys are surrounded, Daniel, by media in New York City all the time, media capital, I guess, of the Western world. So this question, I think, most appropriately goes to you. How much of the collective angst that we feel as a society is based on the headlines that we're reading, seeing, and hearing about every day?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a difference between a narrative of trauma, as the author said, and actual trauma. As a friend of mine recently said to me in discussion about this, there have been many times throughout history when we've thought that the sky is falling, but sometimes the sky actually does fall. Things are different. And climate change, which I think that you included in that list, is the new and most significant factor here. I mean, the fact of the matter is we do have to worry about change and about catastrophe and about environmental collapse in a way that we never had to before. These things are always on our mind. We're going to be constantly reminded of them. I don't think in this case we can lay it at the door of CNN that it's causing us angst and anxiety and nervousness. We might have to lay it on the doorstep of ourselves and on the actual reality of the world.
Do you think, Patricia, that CNN, I mean, we're pulling CNN here as the representative basically of 24/7 media, does it get some of the blame for not just the anxiety that many feel, but even the anxiety that the worried well feel?
I'm not sure at this point how much the sort of 24-hour news cycle matters. I think what's different is that, you know, if you talk about what Daniel's saying, and you have somebody, you have very, very deep and very important menaces that we can't deny. But what tends to happen is it's very difficult for people to worry about something that they can't do anything about. And so they'll displace that anxiety. So when you provide them with all kinds of convenient, sort of news-driven, concrete threats, then they'll glom onto that as something to be worried about. I see this sometimes with my son, actually. So he is genuinely,
how old is he?
He's 13.
Okay.
And he pays a lot of attention to the news, and he is genuinely feels powerless about climate change. He is being taught by his teachers that there's essentially nothing he can do, really. I mean, he knows that he can change a light bulb, but he also knows China exists. So what he will tend to do is take something else that's sort of more manageable to be afraid of, in a sense, and react to that.
Like what?
Well, like, you know, some news coverage of somebody being loose in the neighborhood who's going to, you know, rape and kill children or something like that.
So much
I'm
more
not saying
immediate.
that's more manageable, but yeah.
But it's more immediate as opposed to.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so what the news media does is it provides all those targets for people to react to and glom onto when they're really afraid of something much more deep and diffuse, I think.
Alex, I wonder whether 9/11 was a signature moment for this generation, insofar as, I don't know, you see kids all the time, so are there young people who now fear going into buildings because they're afraid planes are going to bang into them or the concrete's going to come falling down on them?
One of the things that happened in my practice on that day, I was in my office, and my kids were quite young at the time in a daycare, you know, and it's a great, maybe I'll tell the story because it's a great example of how anxiety can be so maladaptive. We need to think about how it can be adaptive too, by the way. But you know, we're all looking at those televisions. I remember that morning, and we're looking at these television screens, and our parental anxiety is going up. And what happened in daycares across the city is anxious parents rushed to the daycares to pick up their kids, to protect them. And in fact, everything was fine for those kids until the moment when their anxious parents swooped them up, and now they had something to freak out about.
They were not watching CNN
they were
at 8:45 in the morning.
We can literally sort of infect them with our anxiety. But can I just go back to what you said, Patricia, around, you know, when we have anxiety, we can't do anything about it. Let's just define anxiety just for a moment, and I think we can, in a very simple way, distinguish it from fear. You know, fear is an in-the-moment response. It's present tense. You're under attack. Someone's charging at you with a big stick. You have a fear response, very basic brain response, base of the brain, or lizard brain as they call it, right? And there's a fight-flight response at that point. It's in the moment. Anxiety is different from fear in one respect. It's always anticipatory. It's about something in the future or something in the abstract. You need frontal lobes for anxiety, and we got those. So anxiety is really the quintessential human emotion. It's actually, ideally, a very good emotion. It's what sets us apart from all the animals. We're the ones that plan ahead because we're worried about the winter coming. You think about our caveman ancestors, you know? So you know, ideally, it's a valuable emotion. It's adaptive. What we've got today is too many people with maladaptive levels of anxiety or maladaptive anxiety. And critical point, when it's things that we can't do anything about, we're set up for this more maladaptive type of anxiety.
Quam?
The thing about anxiety, and I totally agree, is that it can be useful. And, you know, there's this curve of performance, of anxiety and performance. And the more anxious you get, the better your performance. So that's fine. And then you level off, more anxiety, not so much performance. And then you go, bang.
Too much anxiety,
yeah,
you're straight down.
Too much anxiety, you become the Leafs. So, you know, and you freeze, or the Montreal Canadiens. It doesn't matter which.
Leafs is good.
The Leafs are good because they're a brilliant team. And, you know, they did very well, and then people get things wrong, too much anxiety, make the wrong decision. The thing we've got at the moment that is important with regards to the 500,000 children at the moment today in Ontario who have mental health problems is their mental health problems that stop them being able to perform properly. Stops them being able to perform properly.
Because the anxiety is too high now.
The anxiety or the depression or whatever is too high, so the performance goes. So we can't call that group of people people who don't need help. Now, whether the help is a help of a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or whether it's self-help through education about how to self-monitor and self-treat, doesn't matter. You just have to do something about it. We can't ignore it and say, just be stoical, because they can't do it. They're not able just to be stoical. It's gone past that point. And so we have to think of what we're going to do with that 500,000 kids today who need some help.
Can I ask you, how do you know that? How do you know it's that? We have 13 million people in Ontario. How do you know 500,000 need that help?
Well, there's studies that have come out, and there's just one come from, I guess it's from the Ontario legislature, came to the figure of 500,000 children at the moment.
Kids.
That's kids.
Just kids.
That's just kids, 500,000 who have mental health problems that interfere with their functioning at school.
Daniel, I should bring you in on this because you certainly don't have to go back as far as 9/11 to find a catastrophic event that may have affected the anxiety levels of New Yorkers. Obviously, Sandy is not too far in the rearview mirror. Can you tell us how New Yorkers, people from New Jersey in general, how they dealt with the anxiety around that?
I'm not sure they much did, other than concentrating more and more on the problem, which is a good thing. I mean, this is one of the instances in which anxiety is adaptive. Finally, you see the threat, and that anxiety makes you focus on it and makes you concentrate on it. The problem, though, and I think the tension that's coming up in this conversation, is that you want, when people are feeling anxious in a way that's impeding their lives on a daily basis, you want to identify them, you want to treat them, you want to have a clinical perspective. But one thing that we've learned about how anxiety and other mental health problems work is that there's a kind of dynamism between the experience and between how we think about them, how we talk about them, what the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking calls dynamic nominalism. So that we're experiencing more anxiety now, but the more that we talk about it, even on shows like this, the more that we talk about it as a disorder, the more people identify their anxiety as disordered thinking and something that needs to be treated, and the more anxious people there are. There's kind of a feedback loop that happens. Doesn't mean that the experience isn't real. It just means that we have to be very careful about what I think before the term was anxiety affirming or infectious. You can infect people with anxiety simply by talking about it and focusing on it and using these figures. Now, I don't know what the way out is, because of course you do want to help people and you do want to use the mental health resources that we have, but there is a danger inherent in there, and I think that tension's coming out in this conversation.
Daniel, let me do a brief follow-up with you, which is you were on the program last night and you were candid enough to acknowledge that anxiety disorders are a factor of your life that you are dealing with. This is a challenge for you, and I'm wondering, when Sandy came through, did your anxiety disorder needle start fluttering away?
It didn't, because my anxiety needle about environmental and ecological problems was already pretty high and has been for a long time now. So it didn't flutter. Certainly the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and my anxiety level went through the roof. And I did exactly, or I wanted to do exactly what I think Patricia said, which was run to my daughter's school. I was able to stop myself, but that's what happens. You start seeing the threats everywhere, even though that the statistics show that a public school is one of the safest places that your children could be. That's right. You start to see the threats everywhere. So it didn't with the hurricane, but it certainly did with the school shootings.
Interesting.
Very much so.
Quam, a follow?
Yeah, I think it's correct that there are some people who are susceptible to having infectious anxiety, but that's not usually the case. Most people who get anxious for good reason, or what they think is a good reason. Now, there's a difference between making something clinical and having solutions. So you can educate people about their anxiety and how to decrease anxiety. I used to work in a college where we'd have these high flyers who would be over that anxiety performance curve, and they'd be right down at the bottom. And what they'd try and do to get over their lack of performance was to do more and become more anxious. And actually telling them about the fact, well, actually this is a place where you might want to do less. and your performance will go up. Now, it's a pretty difficult sell when you've taught yourself all the years that you just do more, you work harder, you do better, to actually say to people, no, this is the time where you do less and you perform better. It's a very difficult sell, but when you can educate people about that, people find that their performance does improve. And it's a pretty straightforward thing. It's not medicalizing it, it's using the appliance of science.
I saw you scribbling something away there, Ian. Did you want to add something?
Well, no, I think Kwam's point is excellent. There are good reasons to be anxious in this day and age. And one thing we haven't talked about yet are the social media. And the social media, driven by digital technology, I think is tremendously inducing, anxiety-inducing. I see this in my own kids, in their friends, in my students. There seem to be no boundaries anymore dividing people, and there seems to be no sense of privacy anymore. An innermost thought one day that you tweet can be viral the next day, and so everybody knows what's going on in your life, in your experience. That's a tremendous change. I mean, it's one that I would have thought unimaginable when I was in university, for example, not so long ago. And it's something that I think is really is a factor that's very important and gets to what I think is the other category of reasons, and that is that we do live in an illness-breeding society, and technology is driving that to a large extent.
Can I just add to, yeah, you're sort of talking about some of the factors that are contributing to this anxious age, and I'd add in, as you're talking about social media and our children growing up within it, you know, this is also happening at a time, and there's other unprecedented things happening historically right now, including how wide open the world is for young children in terms of who they're going to be. Children aren't under actual threat anymore in the fear sense. Right? The challenge for kids these days is to become a person with an identity and a self and a set of values. And it's all wide open. You know, Nietzsche said 200 years ago, man is doomed to be free. And boy, it was never more true than the 21st century. You know, it's all wide open. And so children have to work to define themselves, I think, more than any other children in history. And there's a kind of performance of self on Facebook and so on that's inherently stressful. Existential anxiety is what we're talking about here.
I remember when, it's a funny story that's based on, I remember sort of in the 80s and the 90s, you go into a coffee shop and you say, can I have a coffee? They give you a coffee and your choice is milk or cream.
Or not milk.
Yeah. Now you get to the front of the line at Starbucks, and if you're not ready with your skinny, tall, whatever, triple double, or, you know, and you're standing there and there are people behind you, but it's that hegemony of choice. Loads and loads and loads. I just want a coffee.
Adds to the anxiety.
Tell me what I want.
Yeah, tell me what I want.
That's right.
You know, and the thing about being told is you can push back on it, against it. I don't want to do that. But you know, you're given a choice, you push back on it, and that's the dialogue. But this, the world is wide open, be whatever you want, and we'll support you, is a very, very frightening place to be for a lot of people.
Patricia, let me put the focus on you for a second, because you also had a piece in the New York Times that I want to quote here, but last summer, I gather, you found a tin of powdered butter in your basement, part of a kind of an emergency stockpile from once upon a time. And you wrote in the anxiety column that we talked about in the New York Times the following. You wrote, there is nothing inherently irrational about vigilance, disease outbreaks, climate disturbances, nuclear Armageddon. All are entirely plausible scenarios. A whole class of paid worriers must go about the thankless task of monitoring such scenarios. Oceanographers watching sea levels, anti-terrorism experts trawling the internet, geologists keeping an eye on the supervolcano under Yellowstone National Park that has the potential to erupt and kill us all.
I'm getting anxious.
Just listening to all this. There are legions of people out there, I gather, called preppers, who are getting us ready for the catastrophe to come. And you asked in the column, is this healthy? What'd you answer?
Oh, I don't remember what.
You became too anxious about it. I'm just writing about it. Was enough.
Well, I think the thing with prepping is, and this is a peculiarly American phenomenon, by the way. I don't think it goes on quite as much in Canada, but it's a way of translating that sense of helplessness into a kind of recipe for activity. So you can't solve nuclear Armageddon, but you can go shopping at Target, and you can buy what you need. So you're inventing a way to control your environment. I think that's more or less the underlying impulse with that. And whether it's healthy or not, it's a form. What happened in my case was that I was actually very anxious about my finances because I'm a print journalist, and I didn't want to confront that. So instead, I developed this fear of avian flu, and I actually fell into a kind of folie à deux times a million on the internet over getting ready to go into self-quarantine at the drop of a hat if you had to, in case everyone was dying of avian flu. And I did, in fact, wind up buying a large tin of powdered butter to go with my tin of powdered milk and my macaroni, because it just spirals in terms of...
Where do you think that came from? That desire
survival
to do...
acres.
No, I don't. I mean, in you, where did the notion in you that I better prepare for the avian flu bug to come that's going to kill us all, where'd that come from?
Well, it's because it's free-floating anxiety, so it unmoors itself from what you're actually concerned about. Because often what happens is that the thing that you're really concerned about is real, and it's too frightening.
But did you do that with SARS 10 years ago, which actually did come here and was in our city?
No, I happened to be living in Mexico at the time.
So it wasn't a problem. Okay. Well, Daniel, let me follow up with you on this. You know, in spite of 9/11, in spite of Tropical Storm Sandy, in spite of Mayor Bloomberg attacking supersized soft drinks in New York City, all these other tragedies, are these preppers healthy in your view? Is this a good thing?
I don't.
Oh, we just lost our line in New York. Okay, we're going to try and get that back because I want the answer to that question, but I'll put it to you instead. Is this whole notion of preppers, is this a good thing?
Well, I quite like the idea that, you know, you can't do anything, you know, you can't look after the big things, so you're looking after the small thing. Mm-hmm. I know that when there was a change in government and Margaret Thatcher came in the UK, and there was central government control, and it looked like everything was going to pot, there was a rise in home renovation shows. You can't do anything about the big thing out there, but you can do something about, you know, the English man or woman's home is their castle, so you can paint your house, but you can't do anything about the economy. And I think there is something about that. America's you know, I can understand the preppers thinking that they can't control this vast 300 million group of people with politicians which seem a long way away from the people and who are saying things that they frankly don't understand, with an increased level of gaps between rich and poor, lack of cohesion, and messages that tell them that they should fear their neighbour and get a gun.
And get a gun.
And so if that's the case, and if there is a straightforward, clear cultural message, you're on your own, look after yourself, you don't know what's going to happen, then people will prep up.
Ian, this preppers thing that seems to be very, very much the in thing nowadays, historically as well?
Can I mention that my golf instructor in Florida is actually a prepper? I just thought you'd be interested in knowing that.
And therefore he does what?
She,
does what?
She packs a gun. But anyway, I was told she was a prepper. But there, of course, you know, you go back to the Cold War, and you go back to what was going on in the showdown between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. I can remember in school kids being trained to, what was it, duck and cover under their... So there has been this attitude for, you know, periodically through the last 50, 60 years that, you know, all existence, the world could end tomorrow. So I don't think it's new today. I think that that sort of thing has firm historical roots, goes back a long way. But I do agree, having just got back from the United States, that I get a sense that the country is becoming more and more divisive. There's less sense of community. There's less sense that people have anything in common. There's a divisiveness that I think leads to people becoming preppers. And It does have historical roots, but it's not getting any better.
Okay, I think we've got New York City back on the line. Daniel, can you come back in here and give us the answer to that question about the preppers in light of all of the terrible things that have happened in New York?
About whether I think it's normal or not, or healthy or not. I'm not sure that I would call it healthy, but as has already been mentioned, when you have a sense of sort of vague threats, a sense of nervous vigilance, which is one definition of anxiety, a good, handy way to get rid of that anxiety is to do something. With something like global catastrophe, like terrorism, like climate change, you don't have any control over it whatsoever. So you glom onto whatever you can that gives you a sense of control and that sort of can shove that anxiety back down and make it quiescent again. So becoming a prepper seems to be, in the United States, an increasingly popular way to do that. I'm not sure that it does anything but exacerbate some of the social and cultural tensions that the United States is already feeling. We are more anxious probably because the social safety net is not strong like it once was, because we don't feel as if the problems are ever going to go away, because the political tensions seem completely, to a lot of people, almost permanent at this point, and certainly undissolvable. And that increases anxiety. And so what people do is they just reach and they grab on for whatever they can.
Ian, as you look at this through your historical lens, when the times are unsettling, what, generally speaking, gets people through unsettling times?
Well, you know, if we can go back in history. I often tell my students what we're living through is the end of the modern age, which began around the early 1500s. And we're living at the end of that age. One of the reasons is we had these tremendous changes in technology. The great innovation of technology in 1500 was the book. This, in the year 2000, it's digital technology. But what, interestingly enough, a lot of people did back in the 16th century, of course, was explore new experiences of spirituality, new religious options. It was the time of the Protestant Reformation. And you know, as an historian, I'm always reluctant to make predictions, but what I wouldn't be surprised to see in this age of anxiety, coming out of it anyway, is a new religious reformation, the contours of which I'm not going to predict, but I think that religion is a tremendous solve for people who are undergoing anxiety disorders.
Jesus, take the wheel.
And I often think of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 6, the 22nd verse. Essentially, St. Matthew says, and I'll paraphrase in 21st century terminology, have a mental margarita, you know, don't worry about these things. The lilies of the field, God takes care of you. And so anyway, I think that again, using an historical lens, this is something I wouldn't be surprised materializing.
Although, Father Dobigan, the rise of atheism seems to be most pronounced nowadays.
Except that the polls...
it's just most vocal.
Except,
most vocal,
yeah,
okay.
and except that the polls in America and here in Canada, even though they show people aren't church-going much anymore, the levels of people who identify themselves as spiritual are actually quite high. So I would agree with Patricia. I think the new atheists are very vocal. They get a lot of media attention. I'm not sure whether they represent the wide segment of society.
What was that Jesus take the wheel comment you just made?
You know, it's that country song, Jesus take the wheel.
I'm giving myself over to. That type of thing?
Yes.
No more existential
exactly.
anxiety.
No more existential
in the
anxiety.
States, in the most libertarian parts of the America, I'm going to make a huge generalization here, but a lot of the sort of libertarianism in the States goes hand in hand with religiosity. So you've got parts of the States where you have the deepest sort of belief that Jesus can take the wheel. You also have the most comfort with high levels of freedom, because fundamentally they are buffered by their belief that Jesus has the wheel. So that's just something I've been thinking about recently.
It's an emotional load-off in some respects.
Yes, so they can deal with that level of anarchy and freedom in a different way.
Gwen?
No, it's very interesting. So this is a country and western type thing.
They just call it country nowadays.
Oh, sorry. I'm behind. Well,
My
you know,
daughter sings it.
Steve's trying to demonstrate that I'm sort of out of touch with society,
with popular culture.
And just to demonstrate that, there's this interesting. Instead of going that way, I mean, I think the thing is hope. Hope decreases anxiety, and hope can be at a number of levels. And hope can be at a spiritual level, hope can be at a religious level. Religious levels are what we used to use to decrease anxiety previously. But just going back to the musical thing, that mine isn't necessarily a religious hope. It's more, or an existential worry. It's more a balance between the two. And I'd go to Mose Ellison, who's a jazz and performer.
From the Mississippi Delta.
Exactly. And he writes a song called I Don't Worry About a Thing, because nothing's going to turn out right. And you see, if you get to that stage, you can just say, well, just a second, I can live, you know, and ignore some of the big things I cannot do anything about, or even try and control them because I can't do anything, or start carrying a gun which may go off or I might be shot at, or use my money that I haven't got much of in order to build up a stockpile of things that I forget. You know, I don't have to do all of that stuff.
Moses in his 80s, he's had a good life, and he's a pretty blissed out guy most of the time.
Exactly.
So he's chilling most of the time anyway.
He wrote that 30 or 40 years ago, just to demonstrate how out of touch I am.
Okay.
And it seems to have worked for him. Yeah.
Alex, picking up on this notion of hope, can I go back to that example earlier of the young, what was it, 8-year-old who was already fretting about his test results?
Right.
Is it your job under those circumstances to induce in him some sense of hope that he will do better on his test scores and therefore reduce his anxiety?
It's funny, hope doesn't really have a place in our psychological psychiatry parlance particularly. I mean, I don't know of anything called hope therapy, really, but of course, logically, it is absolutely the antidote to anxiety. Anxiety is anticipatory, it's about the future, so is hope. I mean, it's sort of its polar opposite. Technically, to answer your question, when we have those children in our office, what we work at primarily as therapists with young children and psychiatrists as well, I would imagine, is where we get people to evaluate in their minds, what are you actually anxious about, so that they can size up the feared future and see for themselves whether or not the level of anxiety is valid, fits the case. So here's a boy who thought that if he didn't get an A on his spelling test, basically he would be a homeless person. Right? You know, this was the connection in his mind.
And he's 8.
Right. Once you can pull out all the bits, and then you give him a chance to step back and say, well, is that really true? What we're realizing with kids is that we really have to help them get to a place where they realize that mistakes are entirely natural, and that it's a part of the learning process, and they're not a sign that your future is in jeopardy.
And if you don't ace math, you're not going to be a homeless person.
Exactly. And that, in fact, if you don't ace math, what it means is you're learning math.
Got it. Yeah. Daniel, did I see you trying to get in out of town there?
Yeah, well, I just thought it was appropriate that it's the Englishman on our panel who's talking about a kind of sense of fatalism, and using this quote that, you know, nothing is going to go wrong. Since we're talking so much about the New York Times anxiety series, there was a piece in there by an English woman, I think her name is Ruth Whitman, who was just shocked to come to the United States and live here for a while and see how anxious, how nervous everyone is. And she attributed this to the American sense that you can perfect things, you can get better. She said, in where I come from, she said, everyone's fatalistic. Nothing's ever going to get better, and you can't perfect anything. Life is hard, life is brutal, and in the end, you die. So what's the point of being anxious? So it's funny that there might be like two sides to this. You could glom onto hope. You know, things are going to get better, and I feel a sense of hope, and so that's its own sort of self-hope therapy. Or you can take the fatalistic turn, and I often wish that instead of being a neurotic New York Jew, I was a British gentleman who can say, well, you know, things are rough, so let's carry on.
British gentleman.
Yeah. British gentleman.
British gentleman. I wish I was wearing. I wish I were wearing tweed. Then I'd be a proper British gentleman. But there are other things that with kids and with America that come to mind. One of the things that is happening is the rise of diabetes. And one of the reasons why there is a rise of diabetes is because of the high levels of calorific food, high calorific food. And after you've taken sort of your meal, and the glucose comes into your system, then insulin comes and takes the glucose away, takes the sugars away, usually overreaches and causes a hypoglycemia. And during that hypoglycemia, people get anxious. They feel anxious. And what they often do is then get more sugary stuff or high carbs, and then they just keep on doing this. And one of the things they found recently in one of the prisons in America was that if you change what people eat and you go for foods that release glucose slowly rather than quickly, you get less anxiety, less fear, less fights, and you get people out of prison quicker. And it's not surprising to me so much that there's this rise of diabetes and this rise of anxiety happening at the same time with people eating a lot. It's also not surprising to me that the rising anxiety goes with rapid urbanization worldwide, because we know that being in contact with nature, seeing green and green space are all linked to lower levels of anxiety.
Okay, let me pick up on that, because you're here representing CAMH. CAMH has a new campus in Toronto. Much thought was put into creating a kind of calm urban space. And we got some tape I want to play right now, because Alice Liang is one of the architects who apparently helped design this new calming Pacific space at CAMH. Watch the monitors in the studio and roll tape, please.
The smell of any flowers, the fact that flowers draw birds, attract butterflies, the seasonal changes of colors and texture that's related to any kind of planting. All of those sensations evoke emotional responses that actually are very therapeutic for everyone, let alone people who actually have difficulty in their daily lives to access these features of the outdoors.
I should just let you know, that's Green Space and Mental Health, which you can watch in its entirety along with all of our Mental Health Matters content, all of it on our website. A lot of very good, short, but helpful, informative videos, I think, on the website, theagenda.tvo.org. Quam, what is it about green and green space that seems to help encourage better mental health?
If I knew, I would bottle it. That's the truth, because it seems to, all worldwide, there's loads of literature that seems to show that green space and being in contact with nature decreases your levels of anxiety. Also increases your ability to deal with marital stress, increases problem-solving skills, and makes you do better at school. The thing is, we always used to know this, and that's why out of Toronto, people at 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock on a Friday, they get in their cars and they go out into the country. I've forgotten, you know, because I'm such a city person. I didn't know what it was called.
The great outdoors.
Yes, the great outdoors.
Up to Alex's cottage.
Up to Alex's cottage. Well, thank you for the invitation.
I'm on my way after the show.
So, you know, people know that it makes them feel better. But one of the interesting things I read recently was seeing nature is okay, but is nowhere near as good as actual contact with nature. So if your neighbor has a lovely green garden, that doesn't work anywhere near as good as having one yourself. And it's even better if you start planting things, touching nature, doing things yourself.
Gardening helps mental health.
Yeah.
It does.
It does. You garden? You're a gardener?
No, sir.
But it's funny, it's that expression being grounded. I mean, it's where it comes from.
Oh, grounded, of course.
And you know, there's that. I'm gonna garble it, but there's that old adage: if I'm thinking about the past, I'm depressed. If I'm thinking about the future, I'm anxious. I mean, it's obviously an oversimplification, but the point being that what we need to do and make sure we take time to do is be thoroughly in the present. When you're gardening, I know it's going to grow and there's some future involved, but it's a grounding a moment in many ways, including centering you in the present.
Let's get Daniel and Ian on this as well. Daniel, you first, please.
Well, I think Kwam is absolutely right, and the reason that I believe that being around nature and being immersed in nature is reduces anxiety is that it captures our attention, the studies show, in a different way than, say, a car horn or a construction space in a city. Those things, sort of, our attention becomes laser focused on these things, whereas walking in green space, studies have shown it's restorative because our attention is kind of diffused. It's captured by these things, but it's captured by them in a soft way and in a gentle way. And so this allows us to kind of restore. I find living in New York City to be exceedingly anxiety-provoking, exactly for the reason that I'm not surrounded by enough green space. And I think it's absolutely right to say that as the planet becomes more urbanized, anxiety inevitably becomes more of a problem.
Ian?
I thought that vignette was very interesting, Steve, because it reminded me, of course, that when the Queen Street Mental Health Center was founded back in the early 1800s, it was like many of the prototypical asylums of the day. It was actually located on the outskirts of a town, of a city, in a bucolic landscape, and the whole idea behind these asylums was that the patients would be closer to nature, and that would have a pacifying effect on their nerves.
But they did build a big wall around it as well, which might not have been that helpful.
I think that came later, but I could be mistaken. But that was the theory, that that these folks would be healthier, mentally healthier, the closer they were, or the more they were out of the city. So history can teach us these kinds of things, and I'm not sure whether the folks down at the Queen Street Mental Health Center had that in mind when they made these changes. But it resonates with the historical experience.
Let me read one more thing. I think we've got a few minutes left, and let me read this from the Chronicle Review from last month. Elaine Showalter, who writes, perhaps we can get a little perspective by asking ourselves whether Americans are more anxious than Syrians, or more depressed than the British during the Blitz, or whether academics are more depressed than unemployed factory workers or phased-out journalists. Patricia, how about a little perspective here? What do you think?
Well, I think that's an unfair question, actually, because if you're in Syria, you're dealing with fear. You're not dealing with anxiety necessarily. It's a different thing. That's why some of the World Health Organization data shows that people in countries where you would expect to see fairly high levels of disordered anxiety and depression, you don't. It's not a reactivity to a real threat in that sense, right? So I'm not sure that that's a fair way of phrasing the question.
Ian, you want the last word on this?
I don't want to sound patronizing to Americans. Sorry, Daniel, but I think that one of the things that's key here is that the American experience, and Daniel was talking about this a little earlier, was that the country's been built on hope and optimism about the future. And I think that that's waned considerably in the last few decades in the United States. And so whereas you don't have the stoicism of, say, the British Empire, you have those constant expectations rising, and I think that this recent recession has done a great deal to dash those expectations. And as a result, I can understand fully how that creates high levels of anxiety.
Well, I hate to leave things on such a downer note, but we're out of time. And after all, we started the program with having a lot of fun, so I hope it all balances out in the end. Can I thank all of you for participating in our program tonight, starting in New York City with Daniel Smith, more of his thoughts in the book Monkey Mind, a memoir of anxiety. And back here in our Toronto studios, Kwam McKenzie from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, Patricia Pearson, she's got her book too, A Brief History of Anxiety, Yours and Mine, Alex Russell from the Hinks Delcrest Center in Toronto, and Ian Dobigan, the University of Prince Edward Island professor, and his book, The Quest for Mental Health. Thanks so much, everybody.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.